Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, all the way from the lawful dystopia of Chicago, we have writer, podcaster, independent iconoclast, our walking, talking Library of Alexandria, Miguel Connor. Miguel, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Gordon. Love your work, love your podcast, and it's definitely an honor being here.
Well, you as well, as we were just saying before we hit the record button. You've been in my ears for many a year's commute. I absolutely love your show. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Really appreciate it, and again, love what you're doing. Let's do it. Let's do some heresy.
Yes, indeed. Well, actually, I can kind of segue that into the traditional opening question. Miguel, were you a weird and or heretical kid?
I would say so. I mean, I think you probably could just have a list of your guests and you'd probably just check off, curious, anxious, having visions, having mental problems, the whole thing. So yes, I was actually. And it's funny because when I ask guests this, I always go, okay, that's probably really the most important part of the interview because people get insights and they can relate to everybody's spiritual hitchhiking, if you would. But then when I'm doing a podcast, that's the one question I hope they never ask me because I feel, well, my life is just not that interesting and I'm trying to get back to the past. But I was preparing for your interview. And I was thinking, well, what if you asked me my first hints of gnosis?
I'm going
when
to.
Did I?
That's happening.
Well, I've got it ready for you. I don't have it written down, but I have it ready for you. And I was thinking, when did I realize things were not as they were? That regardless of who I was as an individual, that the universe around me was something of a big fiction, and the old trope of everything I've been told was a lie. And of course, I was raised Catholic. I lived as a child in Mexico, and in those days, Mexico was very liberal Catholic, so it had that mystic vibe to it. But in an event, it was still Catholic. I was still taught the dogma, even though my mother, whenever I would point out the old Gnostic or Marcionite question about, Mom, why is the God of the Old Testament such a jerk? And then he seems to have become a good dad when Jesus came. And my mom would say, oh, no, that's Old Testament. It's just myth. These are just ancient people trying to figure things out and weaving this myth. And to me, that, of course, informed me because I saw things differently. I didn't have to take this Old Testament stuff seriously. Nonetheless, I was still raised Catholic with the whole heaven and hell and all that faith and good stuff. And what really changed me were two things. One was I started in my early teens, very early teens, probably 11 or 12. I got a hold of Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné series. And that to me opened my mind because I realized, wow, there is a multiverse. There is layers and emanations of reality. And it's okay to deconstruct our heroes and find meanings. And there is something very engaging and wonderful about the whole anti-hero saga, which, as I'm sure we'll get to it, that really plays into the whole Gnostic ethos. The other thing was, believe it or not, was Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits. When I saw that movie,
why not? He's a great director. Yeah.
Yeah, that movie made me realize that, again, the universe is probably a false construct. It's okay to deconstruct and break down reality and different possibilities and different versions. And everything in the end is a joke. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but at the end, the supreme being doesn't seem too with the program. The manifestation of evil seems to be where all the knowledge is, and we're all sort of thrown in there with at the play of these different agents that control us, and it's all pretty absurd. So between Moorcock and Gilliam, those were my first hints of gnosis.
Is that why there are Time Bandits quotes in some of your intro pieces, specifically the one about, look how he spends his time, 93 species of parrots, nipples for men?
That line blew me away. That made me question everything, because I was like, yeah, nipples for men. Obviously, these days there's answers to this, but you can take those questions down some very interesting roads. And the whole idea of the personification of evil, or Satan, whatever you want to call him, saying, when God started creation, why did he waste his time with daffodils and 43 species of parrots? Yeah. Why didn't he start with silicon chip or something like that? And, the whole Luciferian vibe.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll certainly get to it, but you can think yourself into a Gnostic perspective just by logical analysis. Just like, well, here appears to be the official story, and it's it's probably not a particularly good description of reality, because you can think yourself with it almost sort of up late stoned sophomore questions.
Oh, exactly. And I mean, you can take it further. Soon after that, I watched The Life of Brian, and I never realized later how true that movie was, with the different factions going around. There was so much about that movie that really goes into the heart of alternative Christianity. I mean, those guys knew it. And the scene with the UFO these days, I think, is just perfect, because it just ties it all into the whole, the occult movement and what it is. I mean, you can't have mystic Christianity without UFOs. You can't have an awakening without a sense of humor, and you always got to look on the bright side of life.
No, exactly. Well, let's bring it back to the childhood thing. You mentioned visions somewhere in there. Was that prior to the discovery of, Moorcock and Gilliam? Was these, childhood hallucinations, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say it was mostly, as Jung would say, the active imagination, sort of that child that doesn't fit in, so he has to sit in his room reading books, listening to Pink Floyd in the dark, sitting around with his mind going around and around like a galaxy. I mean, any visions I had? Yeah, I think my first vision was I had some friends who had UFOs experiences. And being I was always I tried to be as rational as possible as a child. And I remember tell me about it. How come I haven't seen it? And these kids, my friends, said to me, no, first you have to believe in it, and then you will see it. And me saying, well, that's completely delusional. You're projecting. There are no UFOs. And they said to me, no, think about it. And I said, okay, I'll be open-minded, which is, again, another thing that I've realized late in life. You really have to open your mind for things to happen. And we were going on a trip down to a camp outside of Mexico City. I mean, way out in the middle of nowhere. And I remember looking up and seeing a UFO flying by. And the first thing I said, man, I am delusional. This is a dream. It can't be happening. But all these kids around me, including my friends, were screaming like, did you see this? Did you see this? And I realized, whoa, I just had an experience. And that definitely taught me, again, keep an open mind, because these things do happen. And since then, towards my late teens and 20s, sometimes with entheogens and other things, I've certainly had plenty of experiences.
Yeah, interesting. I finally got someone on the show who saw a UFO as a kid.
I forgot to tell you also, the thing too is, being in Mexico, it really wasn't that traumatic or life-changing, because living in places like Mexico and South America, or I was born in Portugal, going back to Portugal, you have a sense of magic realism, where when something extraordinary happens, it's really not that big of a deal. It's sort of woven into the culture. So that really helps, something that we don't have, or seem not to have, here in the West.
Yeah, it does really help, and it probably speaks to why Mexico, even today, is a worldwide epicenter of UFO phenomena. And in fact, for about 5 years in the 90s, Mexico City was like the hotspot. It was like people would see UFOs every night. At a while there, it was the largest city on Earth, so I suspected that had something to do with it if they were aliens. But going on a more, Jeff Kripal angle, it's you have a confluence of people who do have a magical realist milieu. So
right.
If there is, and it probably is, some kind of interaction between consciousness and manifest phenomena, then you get enough of those people together who can think like that, and you're more likely to, it's like chumming the water. You're more likely to see them.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I remember going back to Lisbon in 2006, and being at the airport and seeing some newspaper saying, UFO sightings have increased this year. And then, a few days later, I was out in the country outside of Lisbon towards the mountains in Sintra, and suddenly having another UFO experience with my son, who was 12 at the time, I believe. And both of us just sitting there watching this amazing thing in the sky and running to my family. And my family, I run down the road. We're out in the country to the house, and they, oh, yeah, this happens every night. For some reason, they're very active this year. And the next day, other people in the village seeing the same thing. So again, as you talk about going to the work of Jeff Kripal, that definitely seems to work. And of course, Portugal is where you have the famous Fatima vision, which it's getting harder, but I still could meet people who could remember that day from different parts of the country. So it's, tying back to Terry Gilliam, there's a lot going out there, and the map is somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Well, speaking of that, I know at the beginning of your book, Voices of Gnosticism, you mentioned that you went on the kind of Goldilocks journey we all go on through various things like New Age and blah, 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 and kind of looking for the thing that best matches how you think the universe works. So tell me about that, and tell me about how you landed on Gnosticism, like the first time you heard the word or maybe found a text. Like, what is your Gnostic journey, Miguel?
Oh, well, that's simple, and God, I hope I'm not boring your audience to tears. I hope you're not like in that movie Airplane. You got a rope or gas on you, Gordon. You're about to light it up. That's all I can hope. But it was basically the first time I was at University of St. Thomas in Houston. I was getting my BA, and we had to take all these classes, philosophy, theology, and I was taking an Old Testament course. And the priest, all of a sudden, he's talking about the Old Testament, stops and has to talk about these Gnostics, these heretics who believed in reincarnation and blah, blah, blah. And the only reason it struck me, because obviously the priest would always be talking about different heresy, was the fact, why did he have to bring it up in an Old Testament class of all things? Because they were a Christian heresy. And that struck me, and it stayed with me. And then later on, as an adult in my late 20s and so forth, I'm doing that sort of religious shopping. I'm trying New Age, I'm trying Buddhism, I'm trying Hinduism, I'm going to a Shiite mosque. I'm searching for an awakening or something. But it seemed I kept going back to that priest, and I simply started study. Some people had recommended Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels. There was the whole Da Vinci Code thing, and I sort of had it here and there, but it really was, I think, 1999, one time when I was in between work. I had just gotten out of rehab, so I was sort of cleaning up, and I had some time in my hand because I wasn't doing bad things anymore. So I was going to the movies a lot, and all of a sudden I went and I saw in 2 weeks, at the theaters, I saw The Matrix and I saw The Fight Club. And in neither one, I had any idea what the plot was because my head was so messed up. I just wanted to go to the movies and they sounded cool. And these two movies sort of were the catalyst that taught me, that sort of wove it all together and said, okay, there's something about this Gnostic thing. I know this thing really is about Gnosticism. I want to follow that path. Later on, as I'm studying, nothing seems to click. I'm reading the Nag Hammadi, I'm reading all these people like Stephen Heller, and I'm like, well, this seems too intellectual. I'm just not getting it. I mean, where's the experience with this? I might as well go back to meditating with Hinduism. And once I read Philip K. Dick Vallis, that's when everything opened up. All my channels opened up. There was something about Philip K. Dick that really was able to put it in a modern perspective. And again, really opened my channels. And then there was ayahuasca vision, later on ayahuasca trips with shamans down in Portugal, and visions of Abraxas. And here I am later on doing this podcast and writing books 10 years later.
So you said you were born in Portugal, but you lived in Central America and you went to Portugal for ayahuasca. That's very global. Yeah.
Well, my uncle was, he's the head or witch doctor of a group called Santo Daime, which is again, a mystic Christian group down in Brazil who uses ayahuasca for all their services. So my uncle just lived in Portugal, but he had gone to the Amazons and brought back and opened up his own church down in Lisbon.
So there's something about Christian heresies in your family then?
Yes, I guess my family, they're all explorers. They're all curious. They all want to. I have an aunt who's a nun. I have uncles who are atheists. So it's very varied.
And it was Vala specifically, because I'm trying to work out if it was 1999-ish. Was the exegesis even in print?
No, that came out a few years ago. No, it was Valis, and then of course the Divine Invasion, and the third book. I forgot the name of it. Timothy Archer or something.
Well, funnily enough, a previous guest of yours, and he's in the book, and I was reading that before the show, so it's fresh in my mind. I think it was Stephen Davies, but was talking about his interpretation of Gnosticism and its obsession with particularly the first two books of the Old Testament, is trying to understand where the universe and mankind came from so as to sort of reverse engineer it back to the original state. So exactly. If that's the shape of the journey, it's something, a mutual friend, Chris Knoll, says that the Gnostics were sort of a sci-fi or writing fan fiction UFO cult, because Philip K. Dick's texts are typologically very similar to that interpretation of Gnosticism, because they are about where the world comes from and where we come from. And so there's this sort of shape that I think people miss and value in reading Gnostic texts, is the shape of the journey is the same. So today a Gnostic quest is looking at the evidence for directed panspermia and other sort of potential scientific interventionist pieces, because the question is the same. How did we all get here? How did all this stuff get here? Where did that come from, and what are the implications for the reverse journey?
Exactly. And interesting you brought up Stephen Davis, because when people ask me, what is Gnosticism? That
was going to be my next question, so you might as well go for it.
Like a friend told me, I said, it's hard to define Gnosticism because it's hard to define reality, and that's what the obsession of the Gnostics. I mean, Philip K. Dick's quest was twofold. What does it mean to be a human, and what is reality? And I think that goes right into the heart of the theme of the Nag Hammadi library. And Stephen Davis told me, he wrote that excellent book, The Secret Book of John, a Gnostic Gospel. Beautiful introduction, which really gets into the heart of what the Gnostics were doing. But he told me defining Gnosticism is this. It's the story of how God went crazy and became us, and how, as you said, we're going to reverse engineer. How are we going to go back to God? What's the therapy we're going to take? And obviously, it's not sort of the Hindu playful, "Ooh, it's an illusion" or whatever. I mean, this is bad news. It's serious stuff that we are insane right now in our human world, in this sort of existentialist fog, barely remember our origins. And of course, you mentioned Chris Knowles, and Jeff Kripal also agreed with that the Gnostics could be the first UFO cult that were in the sense that they felt that they were alienated down on this world. We were the men who fell down to earth, and we'd forgotten where we came from, and this sort of alien God, which is exactly what they called it and what they call him in the Gnostic text, would come and awaken us and tell us that our journey or our home is in the stars, and we must begin a journey beyond the stars. And that itself is, I'd say, was Gnosticism. Do you want a bit of longer answer on that?
Well, I'm going to sort of we'll dig into it via questions, because the other piece that I think helps in, I know people squirm when we say this, but helps in sort of reconfiguring it into a bold sort of, it's kind of a UFO cult descriptor, is not only with the obsession with the Old Testament, the first two books in particular, so the Genesis story, the two Genesis stories, which is probably that one of the reasons why they have that cognitive dissonance, which we'll get into. But the other thing is that they're very interested in those texts like Enoch, and so they don't just live in this sort of crazy God-created universe. They live in a populated crazy God-created universe where there are all these beings that have been quite recently misinterpreted, Nephilim and angels and so on. So the skies in between where we are and our home are quite crowded.
Say the least. Yeah, I think one thing about the Gnostics which separates them, for the most part, from other forms of Christianity or even Judaism, well, even paganism, as they got in trouble with the pagans as well, is that the Gnostics were visionary. They were writing apocalypses where they were going on journeys and recording what had happened to them, very much in the same way Philip K. Dick did. So, and part of the vibe those days, especially certainly in apocalypse literature, was, and also as with the ascension of the philosopher's god, was that many individuals had figured out that the universe, that the gods they had worshipped were probably lesser, probably deficient, that probably the universe was being managed by lesser beings who had their hands in there. What really separated the Gnostics from other groups was the fact that they drew a hard line on the sand. They said, no, these gods or these beings, these angels, these gods, these daemons, whatever you want to call them, they're just not mismanaging the universe, but they're downright negative. They're downright oppressive. They're downright suppressive. There is nothing good about them. I think that's what also separates the Gnostics, because they were probably the only faith in history who really had you might say, the balls to stand up to the gods and say, no, you're out of order. You are way out of order. I think one blogger always said that the Gnostics were raging against heaven. And I think philosophically they were, although, of course, the Gnostics would say, when you read their text, it's obvious they don't think that they're rebelling. They're simply, again, they're having revelations, they're having visions, they're seeing the universe in a whole new light, how it is, this busy place of angels and gods with their own agendas, and they're deciding, we're going to get out of here. We're going to break the whole thing open. We're going to expose things for what they are.
Yeah, and I think that, we're going to get onto this, but by the time, so in later phases, so in a Valentinian phase, they're potentially a bit nicer about controlling powers and demiurges in their cosmology. But at its very beginning, this is kind of the question I'm getting to. I subscribe, and I'm going to ask you this question: do you think Gnosticism predates Christianity, and why and how?
That is a good question. I would say, I used to think that. I would say that the Gnostics themselves probably don't, as we know them, the Sethians and later on the Valentinians. But the idea of gnosis, this sort of cosmic and intellectual knowledge, a special type of knowledge that tells us that we have fallen down, and then we have this inner light, this shard of infinity in ourselves, and that we can find this information to get us back. That probably predates Gnosticism, especially like you mentioned with a lot of the apocalyptic Jews, those writing the book of Enoch and other stuff. And there is a case to say that maybe the Hermetics, at least scholars like April DeConnick, contend the Hermetics actually came before the Christian Gnostics. So I would say for historical value, we probably should say that the Gnostics came during the time of Christianity, but the Gnostic thrust was before. And even then, I do like the ideas of Dylan Burns. He's a professor in Germany, and he has sort of changed the game, because he explains that it's really not fair to say Christian era or Jewish era, because they were both, all of these movements were very liquid and very syncretic. He likes to call it the Judo-Christian era, the first century, first BC, and so forth. And because these groups were all basically sort of in a state of hybridity. They were always changing. The vision or the view of the Bible that we've given wasn't there. They were certainly worshiping pagan gods. They were certainly deeply influenced by Hellenism. So sometimes it's better just to say the Judeo-Christian movement or Judeo-Christian pagan movement of 1 BC, 1 AD, 2nd AD.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because I think the case is quite strong that the sort of earlier text obsession with the Old Testament rather than the New kind of speaks to a breakaway Jewish group, or one of many, that was sort of dissatisfied with the elite politics of the temple at the time. And I think, so for me, I think it's slightly pre-Christian and is a sort of reactionary Jewish diaspora. It has reactionary Jewish diaspora DNA, but it didn't sort of come into its form until it hit somewhere like, Alexandria, where it got to be bathed in Platonism and Hermetics and so on. I mean, my numbers are that at the peak of the Jewish population of Alexandria, about a third of the city was Jewish. So it's still within the kind of Jewosphere of the Eastern Mediterranean, and I think we're kind of missing pieces in that. I get what you're saying, because the word, obviously, the word Gnostic is in theory problematic, although I don't have a problem using it. I think it's a useful term to describe this movement. But it's almost like streams contributing to a river. It depends which one you want to pick where it ends up, because as you say, there's the Hellenism and Pythagoreanism and so on, and there's some patently, if not Egyptian, influences in the the influence of Egyptian land. But I think for me, because again, the next piece was going to be, if you say it's pre-Christian, you have a lot of mythicists on your show, so what do you necessarily mean by pre-Christian?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like somebody was, I was listening to a scholar yesterday, and he was talking, well, when did Christianity really start? Let's face it, most scholars believe Christianity started with the letters of Paul. That's what we know historically. So therefore, Christianity must have started with Paul. People who complain about Paul stole the false Christianity or corrupted Christianity, no, I mean, he is the font. And even then, it's not for sure. These things are very hard to date, and there's no, again, like you said, we don't know. There's so many streams that are floating in and there. If we go to the mythicism, the idea of the Logos and Sophia was already with Philo of Alexandria, and probably before that. So it's a messy stew, Gordon.
Yeah, and you also have sort of Sethian sort of Holy Family Trinities, which they either sort of thought themselves into, which you can do in that sort of Greek philosophical way, or it's an idea they picked up from Egypt. But you have a Holy Family that predates the allegedly physically real Holy Family, which means you sort of have again this 300-year overlap about which stream do you want to pick to say where Christianity started. But so, what's your opinion of the historicity of Jesus then? I mean, I know you've had pros and cons on the show before.
I would consider myself a mythicist. I don't think that we have enough evidence to to claim that there was a historical Jesus, and there seems to be, again, so many Jesuses during, so many Jesuses before. There's even the theory of Jesus 100 years before Jesus. So I would say that Jesus seems to be more of a mythic character. It's not my dogma. It doesn't keep me up at night. I don't put that much energy into it. I feel sometimes, God, if we find out that there is a historical Jesus, then which version of Jesus are we going to get? Are we going to get Jesus the Stoic, the itinerant rabbi, the apocalyptic teacher? Which version of Jesus is the one that's going to survive from the Bible? I know the most popular one, or the one that's more accepted, is by scholars like Bart Ehrman, which Jesus was an apocalyptic teacher who failed and he was executed. But I like to take more of the stance that that's probably just another narrative, another story of this sort of patchwork character, this mighty projection of humanity.
Yeah, well, I don't think you lose that much sleep over whether Jesus is a myth or not, because you have a more mature understanding of how myth works. Because I'd consider myself a mythicist as well, but I think a lot of the people in the sort of mythicist spectrum are either they sort of range from disingenuous to moronic, because the conclusion is, well, Jesus didn't exist, ergo there is no God. And for every piece of the kind of mythicist puzzle that comes up, I think the opposite. I'm like, I can finally, my issues with growing up in a Christian milieu was that I was expected to believe these things literally happened, and there's this funny little beardy man walking on water and crashing weddings and feeding people, and you go, wait, what the hell? None of that. And then once you can put it in myth, I mean, being very esoterically inclined, I recognize the power of myth. And so once you kind of put it back to where I would suspect the majority of the Gnostics thought these stories were happening, which was on that mythic level, then it's almost like, yeah, Jesus comes back to life.
Oh, yeah, you're certainly preaching to the choir, Gordon. It like you, has expanded my consciousness and gotten me closer to outer realms when I see Jesus, or really any figure of those days, in again with that mythic resonance. So to me, it's a lot richer, and it's certainly a lot more fun.
Yeah, and it means Jesus has actual parents, because we were talking about things like the Holy Family and the Logos and these ideas, and they are, very powerful spiritual realities. And so we're kind of plugging it back into a live socket in the wall. And for me, I think this is some of the benefit for people who maybe have some erroneous views of what the Gnostics think. Maybe I think there's a benefit in going through those texts, because, I mean, typically there's a sort of wider neo-pagan rejection of the Gnostics because there's a presumption of how they view the physical world, which we're about to get onto. But it's quite difficult. One, they inherited a lot of that from pagans anyway. But two, because when we're talking about that Judeo-Hellenic world in the Eastern Mediterranean, that world gave us Orthodox Christianity, it gave us Orthodox Judaism, it gave us heretical versions of both, it gave us the classical philosophers and the church fathers, and really everything, including the Gnostics. And so if you're kind of looking at an incomplete view of magic's and paganism's origins if you miss that piece out.
Oh, I would certainly agree with you. I think one of the viewpoints that I see so wrong with neo-paganism today is that they assume that the ancients were sitting around worshiping nature and running around without their clothes, having wonderful orgies every 5 seconds. And that is, of course, incorrect. And many scholars have pointed this out, that the pagans certainly didn't really like nature. They simply worship nature or the gods to keep them off their asses. And they certainly probably weren't too keen on many of the gods. And I think the Gnostics were the first one to just outwardly say, all right, we're putting down the glove and we're going to find something better out there. So the idea that nature was worshipped is, again, I think wrong. And of course, it makes complete logical sense. I mean, nature is not good and nature is not kind. It has its own agenda. And most of the time, the agenda is to pretty much destroy us and mold us into something new, into something different. The Gnostics probably had the same view as the ancient pagans, where they said, there is divinity in nature, there's a consciousness in the nature, and there's certainly a suffering in nature, and we can make this suffering better, and we can connect with the divine aspects of nature. But on the whole, this is not something good. This is not a good construct. And again, I would say that probably the ancient pagans, Jews, and Christians probably agreed with this view of nature. I mean, what we have today is not nature, Gordon. It's sort of a raped, enslaved, shaped nature to the advantages of humanity. And the other part, what was the other part of your question?
Well, I just wanted to jump in there and agree and say that holy doesn't necessarily mean nice. And
right, yeah.
Encounters with God, as Jeff Kripal points out, can kill you. So, yeah, neo-pagan view of the general niceness of nature emerges in sort of post-industrial culture that goes out. So in the case of, witchcraft with Gerald Gardner, the sort of Edwardian hobbyists who go out to a nudist colony, for the weekend northwest of London, that's not nature. But Britain hasn't been nature for millennia because, humans showed up, cut down the primal forest and started farming it. So this is where I think the value I'm an animist, so I obviously recognize that same divinity and sanctity in nature, but it doesn't mean I think it's nice. I love sharks, but I'm not going to hug them.
Yeah, and I would go further. I would even say, first I would say that the Gnostics weren't world haters. They were more like reality distrusters or reality rejectors. Hopefully I'm not making up my own words. And the fact is that even before the fad of loving nature in the West came up, they were probably the most eco-friendly of all the religions, specifically when you get to the Manichaeans toward the 3rd century. The Manichaeans would not even walk on grass because, as Mani said, God is in every blade of grass. They didn't eat meat. They would worship trees, but basically because they wanted the consciousness or the divinity, the divine spark of the trees to come out. They were non-violent, and again, when you look at their mythology, it's pretty hardcore, very science fiction, almost Cthulhu sort of way, but they did see an immense beauty and an immense divinity and consciousness in all of nature. So in some ways, they were certainly ahead of the times. And the other thing, too, is that when you look at the Gnostics' culture, they always wear the clothing of the society around them. When they were in Rome, they were part of the Christian congregations. They went to the Hellenistic universities in Alexandria. In the medieval times with the Cathars, they were entrenched with the nobility and the population. They looked like medieval dudes to you and I. The difference again was in their ideas, which was always so radical and always so threatening to the secular and religious powers that controlled any of the regions. That's probably why we have like an argument about how the Gnostics were teetotalers. Probably might not be true. Again, they were probably as conservative as the Romans were in Rome and so forth. But they probably did practice some sort of sex magic, at least the ones in Alexandria, because that stuff was in the air. And of course, they weren't doing just to get their rocks off so they could go home and watch Netflix and then worship nature. They were doing it because that was a part of the culture for those seeking an expanded experience.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I presume you've read Tobias Churton's latest book?
Yes, very good. Yeah, and had him on the show. I think he makes a good case, and there are actually other scholars who have told me, and we're talking scholars, the very translators of the Nag Hammadi library, who seem to think that the Gnostics probably might have been in, again, these sort of sex magic rituals in Alexandria. One of the telling clues is that you have like pagan philosophers. You've got Celsus and you've got Plotinus. And they don't like the Gnostics because nobody liked the Gnostics. They're just, I mean, even the Buddhists and the Taoists in the East didn't like them. And and they're complaining about the Gnostics. And they're also complaining about the Christians too. And they're going down this list. Well, they do this. They practice this on Sunday. They have this habit. They do sex magic. Now, the point is they didn't lie about all the other lists, all the other mentions in the list, and philosophers like Celsus and Plotinus, who were so into themselves, so egoic, they felt they had no reason to lie. They said what they thought was the truth. So that right there is very telling, and I would agree with Tobias's work on it too.
Yeah, there's certainly no smoke without fire there. It's for so many sort of groups in the classical world, we've had to unpick the Victorian squeamishness of the early translators when they found it. I mean, they're all on drugs. They're all in sex cults. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, and the other thing too, Gordon, is which is very interesting, and I need to pursue this further. But most people assume that the Nag Hammadi library was buried by these brave monks who wanted to hide this knowledge from the rising church. But as Nicola Denze Lewis says, and she's a professor of religious studies at Yale University, there is evidence that the Nag Hammadi library was never buried by monks or hidden away, but these were actually funerary texts, because that's something that was practiced in Egypt. And therefore, if you look at the Nag Hammadi library, most of them are about the visionary flights, the texts with the passwords to get through the heavens against these archons and angels, these sort of lofty scriptures and so forth. So it would make perfect sense if you were going to do a funerary text for somebody important. You weren't going to bury all the sex magic manuals or information. It's just not something you need to take to the afterlife.
God, what a boring afterlife! I think that's a very good idea, very good analysis, because there's Hermetic text in the Nag Hammadi as well, including the 8th reveals the 9th, and that is a Starship launch sequence if ever there was one. Mm-hmm. So that's a very good idea, and it's typologically the same as how the Book of the Dead worked in the New Kingdom, which was you would collate a collection of customized spells for you. To aid in the crossing. So the shape is still there. And it kind of speaks to what you were saying about how Gnostics will fit the culture that they find themselves in. And I think this is coming back to the world-hating thing. They saw the world the same as everyone else did at the time. I've sort of written about this before. Their view of how reality works was the equivalent of what you'd read in New Scientist at the time. It was all the best ideas. It was Platonism and Neoplatonism. They just disagreed on what we're supposed to do about it.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, again, they had they had, of course, separations. I think one issue that really made the pagans mad, well, probably made the Jews mad too, is that in classic times you would look at these texts, at Homer and so forth, Pythagoras, and even the stories, and you would find allegories and sort of, find insight through these allegories and write about them. The Gnostics were more like directors are today with comic book movies. They said, no, we're not going to find allegory. We're going to rewrite the whole damn thing. We're going to change all these stories and find insights as we write these stories and get visions and use our imagination. So in that way, that was extremely subversive what they were doing, because you weren't supposed to change holy texts, and the Gnostics said, no, we're rebooting this hero the way we like it. Just like Batman, we're going to make Jesus in this story be a shapeshifter. We're going to make Judas be the good guy in this story. And that caused quite a ruckus, even though today it's perfectly normal.
Yeah, I mean, the Hermetics do a similar thing, which sort of, to me, suggests that there is a shared mythopoetic form behind it, because we think they're making it up. We think it's, to again paraphrase Chris Knowles, that it's fan fiction. It is, but it was things that happened on the only level of reality that was real. So the creation of these stories is creating things that can transform you, and they exist in the only level of reality that's real rather than the physical one. And that seems to have been a really potent idea for anyone in these groups who was after that sort of apotheosis, who was after that achievement of, unity with the divine. And it just doesn't compute for the literalist imperial builders, because they can, and it's funny, it's almost a weird echo of the demiurge's era. They can only see the physical, and it must have made them so mad to miss out on this kind of mythic engagement with these new stories and a living form of Jesus or Seth or whoever's in the text at the time, Isis in some cases, that kind of thing. And that fascinates me, because we have that same permanent psychological divide today in the world. And I think people like Richard Dawkins must actually be so mad and angry that they cannot have imaginal experiences.
Yeah. Oh, I would say so too. I mean, it seems meet the new boss, same as the old boss. I'm talking about the Gnostics. You definitely have to talk about Hermeticism. They're definitely cousins. They definitely came. I mean, they're really it's the same thing. Of course, the Hermetics had a bit gentler view on nature, and obviously they worked beyond the Christian. Beyond the Christian mythos. But yeah, it really is the same thing today. I mean, the Gnostics, like the Neoplatonists, were very much into using the power of imagination to uncover insights and manipulating myth for an expanded sense of consciousness. So they were certainly part of this thrust. Obviously, the Neoplatonist had a much better luck. They were able to survive into the Byzantine Empire and survive even further. They were more embraced, while the Gnostics, culture wasn't going to have any of it.
Yeah, my opinion is the Neoplatonists survived because they sold out. They, you kind of see, particularly in the last sort of couple of centuries before the fall of Alexandria, a back and forth about whether you do actually need ritual, whether you do need to do these things, or whether it's all in the head and physical doesn't matter. And you kind of see this hoovering up of all the cool pieces of magic by Neoplatonism and just sort of putting it in the head, putting it in the non-physical, where it's kind of safe. And so Dionysius the Areopagite is kind of porting over these hierarchies into a non-physical world, whereas before you would summon these angels, or you would pray and ask for them to be around, and all that went away. So they kind of got to hide in the head as the empire came down around them on the east and the west. So they're traitors to me.
Yeah, I think I would agree. And somebody who would agree, and I talked to a Jungian expert, is Jung probably agreed, because he thought that the Neoplatonists weren't doing it. They weren't taking any actions. They were just, like you said, sitting in their heads. Well, despite their view, they were very experimental. They were going to church. They were doing their contemplative exercises. They were performing magic. They were actually, again, Gnosticism isn't about sitting around and bitching about the world. There has to be a lot of praxis into it. And Jung certainly agreed. And I think even further, Philip K. Dick certainly agreed that these guys were people of action, not just words.
Yeah, and you see that debate, and funnily enough, I can read in the Asclepius what I consider to be kind of bitchy comments, like sort of a Facebook argument, because that's quite a late text, and you can tell that in the sort of agora in Alexandria, you had people saying, no, it's all in the head. This physical stuff doesn't matter at all. Everything can be done in your head. And you've got the full-blown Hermetic wizards on one side going, I don't think so. You need to, take these drugs and stay up for 3 nights burning this incense and what have you. And then you've got a kind of, the Gnostics going, well, I'll take the drugs, but actually you just need to go and run out into the desert and kind of like scream and, whatever it happens to be. And there are these bitchy comments, reading between the lines in the Asclepius that makes me think that debate went on for 150 years and the Neoplatonists won, because you can't outlaw, I mean, you can now, but you can't outlaw then things that go on in someone's head, but you can outlaw sacrifices to statues or drawing intelligences down into physical objects. That can be banned. And so for me, Neoplatonism, traitors.
Well, you're not alone if Jung felt the same way. But I think that's interesting, Gordon, because the idea of outlawing thought, as Arthur versus Louise, he's a professor here in Michigan who's written extensively about not just heresy but Gnosticism, actually probably started with the church fathers, because what made the early church, Tertullian and Irenaeus and all those guys, so mad is that the Gnostics were like them. They were citizens. They were going to church. If you would come up to them and say, well, I think Jesus is this, they would just look at you and say, yeah, sure, whatever, dude. They weren't, and that made them mad. So the church had to figure out a way to get them. And instead of trying to outlaw their actions, they began to create a formula where they could outlaw your thinking, your opinion, and this machinery sort of evolved and became entrenched into the Christian matrix, and it became a sort of thought control. And of course, one of the culminations later on would be the Inquisition, which began against the Gnostics, against the Cathars in the medieval times. And it became not just what you do, what your rituals are, but what do you think about this? We're going to penalize what you think about this so we can separate you from the rest of the flock. And as Versluis argues, this was later utilized by oppressive regimes. And we have documentation, I can't think of the top of my head, of communist leaders and so forth saying, yeah, we're going back to the ideas of Tertullian and the church fathers to find ways to weed out those who don't agree with us.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You can kind of track that mind control technology through, the Inquisition. And in Spain, it wasn't just Gnostics. It was the thought police of, are you a really, really converted Jew? Or are you a fake converted Jew? And so they went because obviously, the Spanish owed them money, but also it was that paranoia of what's going on in your head. And I find that really interesting. But the Neoplatonists, I think, kind of avoided quite a bit of that. Fortunately, unfortunately, certain empires collapsed, and that Dionysian kind of ornate sort of cosmology of nice, ordered, intervening layers of angels, which was the sort of clean import of the messy pagan world into Christianity, kind of got a bit lost and was sort of, you only found it in monasteries. But this is kind of being able to have this discussion, I think, is one of the reasons why it's important for anyone on the esoteric path to really do a deep dive into it, because the Gnostics are kind of the final third of or final quarter of the sort of Hermetic, pagan, Judeo-Christian, Eastern Mediterranean pie that sort of kick-started Western civilization.
Right, and I think, and I don't know, segueing, or I think it's evolving into this. I was listening to the other day to a podcast, The Sync Book, and it was Alan Green and Chris Knowles, and they were talking about, again, modern times. And they were both agreeing that the Gnostic attitude might be pretty much the only or the best way to survive in these frenetic, absurd times, because we no longer live in a time where ignorance is bliss, because it's impossible to have ignorance in these times. You don't have to worry about the thought police, because they're going to put ideas in your head. You're going to be bombarded. The surveillance state is going to find out where you shop, what you like, and they're not going to arrest you, but they're going to try to manipulate your thinking so that you can go back into the Borg. And they both agree, and I would agree, that Gnostic sensibility of wild skepticism, distrust, but an intense curiosity for the reality behind the reality might be really the only way you can survive in these days. I mean, I know a lot of people have said we live in a Philip K. Dick world, and I would probably agree, not because he was a prophet, but he was telling people this is really the way things are, and they're getting very intense.
Yeah, the sensibility is very useful. They weren't only the original UFO cult; they were the original conspiracy theorists.
Exactly.
The permanent distrust of authority. You see the political conditions in which it arose. Obviously, a dissatisfaction with the temple elite in Judea and dissatisfaction with sort of imperial or regional imperial functioning in places like Alexandria. You see the same permanent distrust of, this is bullshit, you're bullshit.
You're out of order, the gods are out of order, the priests are out of order, the governors are out of order. And and I mean, it's interesting because, like you said, that they were the original conspiracy theories. I think Chris and others have called them the original geeks, those surly existentialist guys in the corner, wagging their fingers at you. And it's true. I mean, the concept of being paranoid, of stalking as many people and entities as you want and getting in their business, that is no longer seen as in the domain of the crazy. But that's one way you can survive in these social media times.
No, absolutely. All right, so we've spoken about a few different groups. So let's have a bit of sort of Gnostic book learning. We use the word Gnostic, and I think again it's valid because I do think there are some things you can say that nail them into the survival of a worldview over time. So I think it's a reasonable enough term. But within that, we have the Sethians. Who were the Sethians?
The Sethians, you would say, are probably the first Gnostics, and some scholars think of them as the original Gnostics. They suppose now that the Valentinians, the Nassenes, the Borborites, and all those probably borrowed ideas from the Sethians. But you might say they're the original Sethians. Some scholars, like John Turner, and you probably agree with this, posit that they were originally Jews who broke away from the temple culture and began adopting Gnostic revealers of sorts. And Gnostic revealers, of course, the Morpheus. That's the character that wakes you up and feeds you the red pills. And originally they adopted Seth, the third son of Adam, which in the Bible says, he's the one that got it right. He's not a jerk like Cain and Abel. And so they again adopted Sethian as his sort of Gnostic revealer, but of course, as their literature changed, as times changed, they began replacing Seth with Jesus. Some texts actually say that Jesus is an incarnation of Seth; he's the avatar of Seth, and so forth. So these would be the original ones, and of course, I would advise people to read Stephen Davis' The Secret Book of John, a Gnostic Gospel, to really get into their essence. The Secret Book of John is one of their main texts, or one of the most popular texts. There's 3 copies in the Nag Hammadi library. So those are the Sethians, and of course they brought us the myth of Sophia, the fallen wisdom of God, who represents basically our fallen state, the soul's high adventure through the spheres. They're the ones who posited the demiurge, which of course was subversive because the demiurge in Neoplatonism and Platonism was a really positive figure, and they turned him into the villain of their play, and they associated him many times with the God of the Old Testament. So these are the Sethians, Gordon.
So you don't see. To me, that's open and shut. I mean, it's not open and shut, but to me, I think Stephen Davis' case is quite good that they were reactionary in that sense, because they did call out the temple god as the dick. In reality. And one of the other things that interests me about Seth and how they viewed him was that there's a whiff of Hermes on it. Josephus writes that Seth wrote on stellae the primordial wisdom before the flood. So you have this idea, and also the fact that if Jesus is Seth, and Seth is an image of Adam, and Adam is an image of God, you have some, if they're not full-blown Hermetic, you have some proto-Hermetic ideas there about a savior in a man shape that is also the image of the true God. And then there's this bit about writing the wisdom on stellae, and I kind of see this weird, I think Stephen Davis is probably right about them being disgruntled, Jewish heretics. And I think one of the places they went, or to be honest, they could have been disgruntled in Egypt, because as we said, it was a very large Jewish population, and Philo was Alexandrian, and he spent a lot of time in, Jerusalem as well, and preferred Alexandria. So there was already a sense of dismay and dislike that you could find in the diaspora community. So I just think that there's something very enigmatic about the shape of Seth and the fact that the villain is the god of the temple. Do you think maybe they came from somewhere else?
No, I mean, if we look at like you were mentioning, the work of Stephen Davis and John Turner, probably started somewhere in Jerusalem or around there, and then, of course, broke away. I'm not sure that they had anything to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Qumran community, and of course made their way down to Alexandria. That's where they seem to have their home base, and then sort of fragmented. I mean, if you look at some other texts, you already see breakaway Sethian texts. The Gospel of Judas, many believe, is a breakaway Sethian text because it has different ideas. It breaks away it disagrees with a lot of the main Sethian texts. And then, of course, they started evolving into the Nessenes, the Borborites, and some of the other groups. Perhaps adopted sexual magical rituals, but then, as Tobias Churton says, in the 2nd century, syncretism became all the rage. Some of them embraced that, and then they began to evolve more as the Neoplatonists rose. They started going into the universities and interacting with them, and pissing them off. But you start seeing the Demiurge and Sophia sort of falling away from their texts, and this indicates that many of them were simply giving up Christianity, moving away from Christianity, and embracing more pagan sensibility. And from then on, they seem to have disappeared. Some believe that they slowly started to convert to Manichaeanism, because Manichaeanism was a form of Gnosticism that was probably more attractive to them, because it offered even more praxis, more rituals, and so forth. And of course, they're being rejected from the universities, they're being rejected from governments. So they might have evolved into the Manichaeans, or evolved into other forms of paganism or Christianity.
Yeah, okay. So the other two we want to talk about, and you just mentioned the Manichaeans, may as well go with them, and then we'll end with the Valentinians.
Yeah, the Manichaeans came from, in I think, end of the 2nd century. You had an individual called Mani, and he had his own visions where his divine twin, his daemon, came and offered him some prophecies, and then he had a vision where a child Jesus came and talked to him. So he founded, he was originally an Elkasite Jew, or that was his family, but he started his own movement of Manichaeanism, which began to spread. He was eventually executed by a Persian king. But his movement really grew and spread. They were very successful because, unlike other Gnostic groups, they were pretty missionary, and they spread all the way to Asia. They spread all the way to Western Europe, and they had a good run. They had a run of about 1,000 years, but again, they were persecuted on all sides of the coin, but they were successful. And then, from what people say, and of course we get the term Manichae or Manichaean, they were the most negative group of all, because their creation myths were something akin to porn, where these demons are masturbating and having menses and creating the world we live. And these demons or archons basically created us humans to store the divine spark they had stolen from this ancient battle between darkness and light, which they borrowed probably from the Zoroastrians. And we humans are just basically housing a divine spark that is really not us, but we need to give it up to the mothership. We need to give it up to the moon so she can carry this light to the other side of the world. But having said that, these people sometimes can't separate the myth from the person. I think this is the theme of this show. The Manichaeans were considered, again, very eco-friendly, very beloved, very knowledgeable, very kind, and just very good people, very charismatic. They walked the walk of being a good Christian, or whatever they were. And but eventually they slowly started, not eventually, after 1,000 years, they died out. And they're considered really probably the biggest Gnostic movement in history.
And their epicenter was Syria-ish, probably, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they had probably
origin,
Mesopotamia. Yeah, they spread out so fast. They had such success in places like Alexandria and in the East. And as Jason B. Dunn has said, they were really the first ones to create a very organized and efficient way of setting up churches and communication and relaying it throughout the land. I mean, there's a lot of things that Christianity probably borrowed from them. They had a concept of the Pope, a central figure that sort of, managed things around them, even though they were not authoritarian. You had two groups. You had the hearers. Those were the ones at the down who didn't have to embrace the vegetarianism or the syncretism and all that. St. Augustine was a Manichaean, and he was a hearer. He just couldn't graduate higher, and he didn't want to become the perfects, that's the second tier that you got up, where yes, you gave up all your worldly goods, you went out and preached, and you basically lived an ascetic life. So that was Yeah, so that's basically more or less what their structure was and how they were successful and what they believed in.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they have those dual layers as well, because if they sort of had an origin in Syria, we can presumably, well, actually, I'll turn this into a question. Do we see the influence of the Manichaeans in the Bogomils and from then on into, say, the origins of Catharism?
Yes, I think we do. There is scholarship coming out where you have, I believe it's the Bogomils are actually reciting Manichaean texts. So there is a connection there, and of course there's so many similarities. Again, the Cathars and the Bogomils had that two-tier system where you had the perfect and the hearers. And of course the mythology, the Cathars had that dualistic mythology where you had Satan and Jesus as sort of siblings battling it out. And that goes back to the Manichaean idea of the powers of light and the powers of darkness sort of going at it. So it's probably not as solid evidence as most historians would like to agree, but I think there is definitely a connection and an evolution from the Manichaeans to the Bogomils down to the Cathars.
Yeah, and we'll close on that evidence piece. So put a pin in that, because tell us about, well, we don't know that much about Valentinus, but tell us about the Valentinians.
Now, the Valentinians were a 2nd century Christian movement, and they certainly, most scholars definitely see, in fact, thought they were Gnostic for a long time, except they seem to be more traditional. Valentinus was a teacher. He came from Alexandria. He moved to Rome in the 2nd century. And in their cosmology, it's very much the same. There is a sort of a lesser god, the demiurge, who creates this world and places humanity on it. Except he doesn't have that malevolent vibe that the Sethians had put on the god. In fact, at the end of the world, when everything is being restored, that is, well, all the divine light goes back to the alien god, and sort of all matter just collapses on itself. The demiurge is going to assist in this whole process, this sort of ending process. But they certainly embraced the myth of Sophia, the fallen wisdom of God, the emanations of the heavens, and the archons. They were just closer to the Orthodox Christians of the time, and the ideas of church, and the ideas of Jesus, and the apostles, and so forth. In fact, some say that Valentinus was actually a disciple of Theudas, who was a disciple of Paul. And according to church fathers like Eusebius, Valentinus came up with the idea of the Trinity. There are stories that Valentinus actually ran for Pope in Rome in the 2nd century, but lost out, came out in 2nd place. Makes you wonder how history might have been changed if this is true. Valentinus promoted the idea of the guardian angel. I guess in those times, the idea of the daemon or the genius was sort of being thrown out the door by Christians. So he said, well, we'll just replace daemon and genius with a guardian angel. That'll be your higher self. And this guardian angel, of course, was a hypostasis or an avatar of Jesus. So, and the Valentinians did thrive. I mean, the church fathers hated them, but they lasted for a few hundred years, and then we don't know what happened. That we do have recorded history of Valentinians being persecuted in different parts of the empire once it converted to Christianity, but in the end, they simply vanished from history.
Yeah. So we're going to come to the evidence piece now, and that's quite a good spot, because in particularly Western Iberian folk magic, there and the attitude to the devil outside of official text. So by we're getting into the Middle Ages now. So there's a couple of hundred years where people vanish. Well, ideas vanish from the historical record, but the devil looks like a sort of hybrid Valentinian, Manichaean, maybe more Valentinian demiurge. Because he's not necessarily evil. He is the Lord of the earth, and one of the first things God created, and is kind of, although dangerous, I mean, God created it, it was put here to run the earth. So in folk magic, witches' sort of, interactions with the devil come from that worldview. They come from They weren't worshipping the devil. They weren't Satanists. It was, this is a being that God created, and its power comes from the fact that it was created before the earth. So it knew all the things in the earth. And there's that I find that really interesting, that outside of the kind of, when we say we don't know where the Valentinians went, it's not like they vanished. It's just that we don't have the evidence for them. And,
or they got absorbed. Yeah, and it's very interesting you say that, Gordon, because I know in Gnostic texts, and later on the Coptic Church would adopt this, Satan's name is firstborn. Yeah. Now, that means you have the pre-existing Jesus, Holy Spirit, God, whatever, but he is the first being created, and of course it's not a mistake. He's created for a purpose. In the Valentinian myth, the demiurge is mostly ignorant, but Satan is the one being in creation that can look up and see the eternal realm. He gets it. He has gnosis. He's the illuminator, and he has enlightenment, but he has his purpose. So these things, certainly evolved. And of course, with the Cathars again, we have Satan is overlord of this world. He's managing this place to the best of his abilities, and of course, Jesus has to come and challenge him on things.
Yeah. So I presume you've read the book The Other God.
By
name escapes me. Anyway, the general idea.
Simone Petrarman.
That's it.
Yeah, a separate God. It's a very good book, big book, but very thorough.
Mine's called The Other God. I bought my second hand. Doesn't matter.
I don't think it was originally English, so.
There you go. That would be why. What I think when you say evolved, what I see is devolve. So as these ideas became unofficial, they were no longer taught, and so they kind of move into an oral form of transmission, which is why we'll never get the evidence. And the Cathars are a very good example. So we'll kind of bundle them together with the fall of Alexandria to the Arab. Well, the fall of all of North Africa, which was the intellectual epicenter of the time we're talking about. To the Arabs that then ended up in Spain, or, most of Spain, who then commenced having the greatest libraries that Europe had ever seen and would see for 1,000 years. You kind of go, and then, just down the other side of the Pyrenees, you have things like a few centuries later, the troubadours and the Cathars and all this stuff happening. We're just you're never going to get the historical X marks the spot. But nevertheless, across Catharism and folk magic, particularly in the areas where this happened, we have this enigmatic shape of the other god.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's hard. It's almost like I would recommend people read Aeon Culianu, who wrote The Tree of Gnosis and another book on Gnosticism. He says, historically, it's impossible to find out how these things went. So you have to find the history of thought. You have to see how each generation's thought process, and as you say, their folklore evolved. And then you can create a tree starting from the Sethians and going to the Manichaeans and going through the Kabbalists and so forth, perhaps even the Sufis, although I think the Sufis are more Neoplatonic although yes, actually what I'm saying is some of the Sufis are very dualistic. What am I saying? But then you can find a tree and you can follow this tree to the root. But again, it's not going to be something that the historical method would agree. Although Culiano was a historian, he was a professor, but he thought this is the way we're going to do it. We gotta go through that history of thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of where I wanted to land it for people who were, magically operant or interested in witchcraft and the grimoires, and thus maybe need to look again at the story of the Gnostics, because for at least a few centuries there, the story of magic was pretty Gnostic, and the kind of what's the word I'm looking for here? The kind of hangover from the sort of de-officializing of Gnosticism shows up in magic.
No, I would agree. I'm sorry. It looks like we got some kids crying out in the hallway here in the house. They've had their fun. But yeah, I would agree. I mean, there is a reason why secret societies from the Freemasons to the Rosicrucians and others do mention the Gnostics here and there. There's a reason why Crowley had to mention the Gnostics, because they're certainly part of the foundation to Western esoterica. They're, as I said, they're the guys, they're those geeks and those conspiracy theories within the world of the occultism and conspiracy theories that are waving their fingers at you and said, no matter how much you think you've woken up, you got to wake up even more. As I say in my show, it's not so much about a red pill, but it's a red suppository. It's got to go up there and crack if you want to survive today.
I love it. I think we're going to have to end it with that. That's too good. That's too good a line. So, Miguel, thank you ever so much for your time. For people who obviously want to know more, where might they find out more?
Well, they can go to the godabovegod.com. Again, I think that was the theologian Paul Tillich who said that when he was talking about the Gnostic God, the other God or the separate God, the alien God of this saucer cult. And they can find information on my podcast, books, articles, and all that other good stuff. The godabovegod.com.
Wonderful, Miguel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. I really appreciate it.
There you have it. Gnosticism, and more Gnosticism. Miguel and I cover the main Gnostic movements, how they relate to Hermeticism, how they relate to the rest of the pagan world, and how the shape of the Gnostic quest survives into the modern day. If any of this is your jam, then jump over to Miguel's site, thegodabovegod.com, and pour through the archives. It's the very best Gnostic resource on the internet. And if conversations such as these are your jam, then please do subscribe in iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so hit up the Facebook page or leave a comment at runesoup.com. Or find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.